Tēnā koutou katoa. 50 years ago, children and young people were being tortured at Lake Alice Child and Adolescent Unit. The Lake Alice Unit was established in 1972, and the very first documented complaint of Dr. Selwyn Leeks' electrocution of children and young people as punishment was made by a 13-year-old boy in December of that very same year. The complaint was amongst half a dozen documented similar complaints made to authorities by children and their families in a 6-month period. But none of these complaints were acted on. If they had been, hundreds of children could have been saved from these horrors. Children as young as 5 years old were sent into a place of abject horror, where they were subjected to torture and abuse at the hands of Dr. Selwyn Leeks and his staff. Most of them were not mentally unwell. They were scared children. Some survivors didn't know, or don't know to this day, why they were sent to the Lake Alice Unit. In the following years, dozens more complaints and concerns were made to every government department that had some connection to the or responsibility for Lake Alice. Complaints were made to police officers, social workers, heads of departments of social welfare, education and health, the medical council, the ombudsman, district inspectors, doctors and nurses. And none were sufficiently acted on. The Crown utterly failed survivors when we owed them a duty of care and protection. And this month marks 5 years since the United Nations Committee Against Torture first found that New Zealand was in breach of our obligations under the Convention Against Torture. It is to successive governments' shame that it has taken this long to take responsibility for what happened. Our acknowledgement on the 24th of July that children and young people at the Lake Alice Psychiatric Hospital Child and Adolescent Unit were tortured, as defined in the United Nations Convention Against Torture, was decades late. It should never have required 2 cases at the United Nations and a Royal Commission of Inquiry, and yet it did. Today, I am announcing the details of redress for survivors who were tortured at the Lake Alice Unit. It is never possible to write for compensation for the torture of children. The Cabinet has agreed to recognise those remaining survivors for the torture that they suffered in the care of the state. It also serves as an expression of our immense regret as to the countless ways in which they were utterly failed by so many people for so long. Redress will consist of 3 components. A one-off payment which recognises the torture of children and young people, a new written apology from the Prime Minister and the Minister of Mental Health, which explicitly acknowledges torture, and facilitating access to support and rehabilitative services. Survivors will be able to choose either an expedited payment of $150,000 or an individualised process where each claim is assessed by an independent arbiter who will make determinations on payment amounts. Both will be administered through the Crown Response Office, who are responsible to me. Up to $22.68 million has been set aside, including operating costs. I have had the privilege of meeting Lake Alice survivors who have made very clear to me the importance of choice. For some, certainty and pace are the priority, but for others, an individualised process is far more important. Our approach provides flexibility for survivors and is more responsive to the different experiences of torture that survivors had at the Lake Alice Unit. Independent legal advisors will be available to assist survivors in the decision about which pathway to opt for and any other legal advice required to inform their decision. The appointment of an arbiter and their terms of reference will be considered by Cabinet early next year. They will be expected to consult with the legal representatives of the survivors on the principles and considerations that will use to determine individualised redress payments. Survivors are right now able to register their intent to make a claim for torture with the Crown Response Office. The details of how to do so are on the office's website. I would encourage any survivor to register your interest as soon as possible. I know that there are survivors who are seriously ill or in vulnerable health, and registering their intent will preserve their claim for families or loved ones if they were to pass away. Survivors will have until the 30th of April to choose the individualised payment process. The expedited pathway will remain open until the 30th of September. Both pathways will be complete by the end of 2025, and payments will be made on an ex gratia basis so that their other entitlements are not affected. The support component will be provided through existing support services and will include facilitating access to financial advice for any survivor that requests it. The Crown Response Office will support survivors to connect to various services based on their need. Officials have also been directed to report back by March next year to the Minister for ACC and Mental Health and myself on any gaps in the current services. These decisions Cabinet has taken are completely independent of any decisions about the future redress system for abuse in care. They are specifically to address the acts of torture on children as defined by the United Nations Convention. This is significant. The advice that I have received is that we are the first country in the world to acknowledge the torture of children and provide something like this as recognition for their suffering. I'd like to acknowledge the survivors of the Lake Alice unit who did not live to see our announcement of torture in July or today's recognition. On behalf of the government, I convey our deep regret to your families that your loved ones passed away without what was happening to them being fully recognised. I'd also like to thank all of the people who have fought for decades for the truth of what happened at the Lake Alice unit to be acknowledged and to be recognised. Many of you have made enormous sacrifices to do so. You, your families, your supporters and the commissioners and staff of the Royal Commission of Inquiry have all played a very critical role in bringing us here today. Today will be mixed emotions, and we acknowledge that for some survivors, this will not meet their expectations. Finally, I'd like to thank the survivors of the Lake Alice unit who have personally engaged with me and my team since July. Leonie, Paul, Malcolm, Carolyn, Tyrone, Jenny and Rangi and Bruce. After everything that has happened, you had absolutely no reason to trust us with the most painful parts of your life. Not just what happened to you at Lake Alice, but how these experiences have impacted your entire lives, but you did. You have shouldered an enormous burden, not just for yourselves, but for others who are not able to. And I am indebted to you for your courage, your grace, your strength and your persistence. Thank you. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
How many survivors do you think this will apply to?
We're not sure. We know that originally there were about 350 children and young people, 352 that went through the unit. But we don't have accurate records now of how many of those are still with us today. So we've made some assumptions, but again, we don't know how many people will come forward.
It specifically applies to torture, right? So do these people, is there a requirement that they have to prove that they were tortured?
Look, there will be, but we will take a very pragmatic approach to this because the records aren't great. There are many gaps. Many of these people, though, have already been through redress payments in the past, through the individualised payments, round 1 and round 2. They will already have the records and notes from what happened then, and many of them have been through the Royal Commission as well, so they will have all of that. So we're expecting that most survivors will have some form of information about what happened to them and to meet that requirement.
How quickly could people get that 150,000?
That will start from March.
You said ex gratia payments. Is that what you meant in terms of some survivors have already accessed some money? Is this money, is it capped or anything? Is that money they've already received deducted from what they might be entitled to now?
No, there are a number of Lake Alice survivors who have been through redress in the past. This is a new material circumstance of torture. This is a very separate payment on top of those payments that were made for abuse and care. And we don't know what the top end might be because we are leaving that to the independent arbiter to make his decision around where that will sit.
Just in terms of eligibility, you mentioned the criteria would involve torture. How are you encouraging at this point anyone that went through Lake Alice to just sign up on that website in case they might be eligible?
But people will be able to see the criteria, and they will know if they were administered paraldehyde or ECT at Lake Alice, they will be eligible.
In terms of the individualised process, separate from the rapid payment, what sort of things will be brought into consideration when determining how much money those people will receive?
But that's to be determined by the arbiter in conjunction with the lawyers on the panel that we're putting forward. And we've made a really deliberate move to use lawyers that the survivors have already mentioned to us, the great lawyers that they'd like us to use, so we've tried to use as many of those as we can. So the independent arbiter will work with those legal representatives to set those parameters and those terms.
Are any of those going to be capped at $150,000, but if an independent panel finds that they believe someone's entitled to significantly more, will you put any cap on that, or what they say goes?
No, we're not putting a cap on it, but Ministers of Finance will provide a package earlier next year when we know how many people have opted in. So we've done some rough calculations, very rough, because as you know, we don't know how many people will enter this process. But we're not putting any cap on it. It'll be up to the arbiter to make those decisions on where people sit.
If someone goes through the rapid payment scheme, gets $150,000, they potentially see someone with a comparable situation go through the individualised process, they might get significantly more. Can they then go and apply for more to retrospectively go through the individualised process, or once they've signed up for the rapid payment, is that it?
Yeah, look, survivors will have that choice. Either the rapid payment, for many of them that's what they want, or the individualised pathway, but they will need to choose one or the other, and that will be fine.
Advice on that, right? You
Yes.
said that you'd have legal advice,
So
if they're confused or not sure about that, they will have independent legal advice, independent from the government.
They will have independent legal advice available to them. But I'd also just go back to what I said earlier about most of these people have been through redress before, and they know broadly where they sit because they've done all this before. And so they have also that information available to them, but it's really important that they sit down with their legal representatives and work through that process.
Is $150,000 a final figure for you if the arbiter takes one case and comes back and comes up with a figure that is significantly higher? Will you change that $150,000 to be more in line with what the arbiter finds?
No, the Cabinet has set that amount and we won't be changing it.
How did you arrive at that $150,000 figure, and can that really truly compensate for the horrors of torture?
No, as I said in my opening remarks, that there is nothing that we can do that will ever make up for the horrors of what happened at Lake Alice. But it was important to Cabinet to provide survivors with the recognition for the torture that they suffered. And can I just say that, as I said in my opening remarks, we are the first to acknowledge this. There is no direct comparison. There are some other countries who have paid out for acknowledged torture in very different circumstances. So, there are no direct comparisons here.
Family members, so for those who have died, are their family entitled to anything under this approach?
This was something that Cabinet considered really carefully. We have decided, as we did with the legal payments and other payments, that in order to register, the survivors will need to be alive. And we have made that in conjunction with previous decisions around redress. So the current redress system, you do need to be alive in order to register. But if you pass away during that time that you're going through the process, your family can continue on.
How did you balance coming to that decision, given in your opening remarks you talked about how this had taken an unfairly long amount of time on successive governments' watches?
Yeah, you're right, and it was a really tough decision. It wasn't an easy one to come to. There are some people who've passed away in the last 3 months. There are some people who passed away in the last 5 years. There are some people who passed away soon after they left Lake Alice. And so it was a Cabinet decision to keep it in line with all the other redress payments.
We've heard a lot about how a redress system isn't fit for purpose for a range of reasons, but do you agree that that principle should stand going forward?
No, I'm being very clear today that this is completely separate. Cabinet looked at this in a completely different light as a new material circumstance, and the fact that we had been found not to meet up to our obligations under UNCAT. So it was completely separate. It will have no bearing on what we do in the future when we look at redress, because it is a completely separate and different thing.
And my question was just about whether you think that principle of abuse survivors needing to be alive to access redress, should that be something that is carried on in the future?
That will be a decision that we haven't made. I mean, it already happens. We've been paying redress for survivors in state care since the early 2000s, and it is the case that you do need to be alive in order to start your claim. It's not up to me whether or not I agree with it. It'll be a cabinet decision as to what the parameters are in the future. We haven't made those decisions yet.
The pot of money, the 22.68 million, do you commit to all of that money going to survivors or support services for survivors, or is it a matter of just spending what is needed or wanted?
Well, it depends. As I said earlier, we don't know how many people are going to come forward, so we tried to set an amount based on some broad indicative figures. We set that at sort of a higher level because we just really don't know. But we will make the payments as per the people that come forward, and for the expedited payment and the people that are paid out.
Cabinet signed off on that chunk of money being for Lake Alice survivors. You'd think naturally it would all go to Lake Alice survivors regardless of who applies for what. The way that we're operating it is that we will draw down the amount that we believe that we need, and Cabinet finance ministers will make that call early next year once we know who's in the process. So we set a high figure contingency that we can draw on.
Having what you said earlier, just having no bearing on future redress for survivors. Can I ask, is there any, because you have done work with this, talking to people about how to implement this redress, there will be no similarities between this and future redress?
Well, we don't know at this point. We have yet to make decisions on future redress. There are a number of considerations that we have to make. We're working through that process at the moment with my Crown Response Office, and those decisions will be made by Cabinet next year, but they will be looked at differently and separately than what we've done today.
How that does look though, like what sort of work are you doing into that particular area?
But there's a huge amount of decisions to be made around timeframes and amounts and people, and a huge amount of decisions to be made. And I've had some of, you've asked me in the media about types of people that might be eligible, and my consistent view is that we don't know yet because we have not taken any of those decisions.
How likely or unlikely is it that you'll need more than the 22 mil?
I don't think it's very likely at all.
You don't think
I don't believe we will need any more.
Because that's about 150 people at the $150,000 mark. I know it's rudimentary maths, but that doesn't, if there are more than 300 people who went through that unit, that seems relatively low, doesn't it?
We know that many of those people have passed away. We know that about 240 odd people have gone through the two redress systems so far. Many of those people have passed away. And we know that because the effects of Lake Alice and their age. So we're sort of roughly modelled on that, but it certainly will not be the 352. It won't even be, I don't imagine, the 240. So
was it always your intention to make this announcement this week, today, or has it been advanced by something, or?
No, Cabinet made their decision on Monday because we have been grappling with this for some time. We wanted, as the Prime Minister once said, he wanted this decision to be made this year, and there have been a number of things, a number of steps that we've had to go through to get here, and Cabinet only made the decision on Monday, and so we wanted to announce it as soon as we possibly could.
In the year? Why so late in the piece? What was holding up that decision being made?
We've had all sorts of things. This is the first time that this has happened in the world. We've had independent legal advice. We've made sure that we understand the United Nations Convention Against Torture considerations. There's a lot of things to take into account. I've also been meeting with survivors on a number of occasions to understand what they want from this process, because we didn't know whether or not we just had a one payment for everybody, which is what many of them wanted, but many of them also wanted an individualised pathway. So there was a lot of moving parts to consider, and it did take some time. And Cabinet took this decision really carefully. We have been talking about this for some time to get to this point.
Who go down the independent legal advice route, will that legal advice be free and it will not be discounted from any payment that they have?
The legal advice will be completely free.
The announcement that you made a couple of months back, people have already had trouble with the Ministry of Health with that. Can you guarantee that people aren't going to have trouble with these payments?
As you would have seen in the media, I said that I was incandescent with rage about what happened with those payments, and I was, which is why I have moved the responsibility for these payments to the Crown Response Office, who are directly responsible to me.
On your survivor, the survivor expectations that you acknowledge that today's announcement it might not meet, can you expand on that? What expectations that you received from some survivors and why you didn't end up going? Why they weren't met, I suppose.
But there are a number of survivors who have a number of different expectations. I've already made some phone calls this morning. There are some people for which this is incredibly meaningful and were hugely appreciative. There were some people, and I knew who they would be, that this does not meet their expectations. And the expectations of survivors are wildly different. And we were never, and we will never, even in the future with Redress, we will never meet the expectations of everybody. We know that. That's why this job is particularly difficult.
What do they kind of range from? The expectations?
Oh, look, there will be some survivors who are expecting millions, frankly. And look, we just, as I said, nothing that we can do will ever make up for what they went through.
In 1999, the government of the time set aside $132 million as a contingency to pay for Lake Alice survivors. You've not come anywhere close to that. Why?
Well, you also remember that there has been a number of other payments to Lake Alice survivors already. So there have been, while this is separate and different and it is torture, survivors will also be able to access redress as well on top of this. So there is not just one payment to take into account. If you're looking at the whole thing, there are other payments as well. And so any Lake Alice survivor who's not already been through the redress process will still be able to do that.
So you said that there isn't a comparison when you're doing this for the first time.
Yeah.
There are comparisons for compensation, though, right? So wrongful imprisonment is $150,000 for each year that you are wrongfully imprisoned. Is that what you have used as a benchmark?
Look, there are a number of different data points. Like I say, there are some countries who have paid out for torture, but it is in very different circumstances. There are numbers like you've mentioned, and I've thought of that number as well. There are ACC payments as well. But look, in the end, when we sat down at Cabinet, we recognised that there is no number, there is no precedent for this. And we knew that whatever we came up with wasn't going to meet some people's expectations, others it would, but we also knew that it was never going to make up for what happened.
That the torture of children is comparable to a year of wrongful imprisonment?
Oh, it's not a consideration that I'm going to go into, but what I would say is that when you look at the MSD payments, the highest MSD payment for redress has been $95,000, and it was important to us that this represented significantly more than that.
The realistic date that the money might actually go into people's accounts, the $150,000.
Yes, March.
And just on the dates, why have you set a cut-off there, both for the different parts of the scheme? We know that for some people there has already been time, but for some people it takes them a while to come forwards. They might not hear the news. They might not have the ability for a variety of reasons to do that. Why should some people in a short period of time be able to access it and not into the future?
But we know many of the survivors, and we would make every attempt through our networks and through their networks to contact as many of them as possible. Firstly, just to register, to get started with this process. It's really important to us to make sure that we had this done next year, because we don't want people to continue to wait, and we know that there will be people, as I said, who need, frankly, that immediate payment, and others who can would want to go through the individualised process. But it was important for us to make sure that by the end of next year we had acknowledged torture at Lake Alice to all of those survivors.
If someone came forward in October, November, December next year and said, I missed this, I've missed the cut-off, here's my claim, would you still consider that?
Look, it's not something that Cabinet have decided. We haven't made that decision. We put these in place so that we can start to make decisions around what does the package look like for the individualised process, and that's why we had to set those dates.
Is there anything you can do for the family members of people that have died? I know you're going to send a fresh letter of apology as part of that 3-step process. That's something that you could do in lieu of being able to give compensation or redress money?
Look, it may well be something we could take into consideration because we do have some of their details, but certainly for the vast majority of them, we won't have contact details.
No sort of commitment on that. It's just, I guess, what you've been able to say today to family members that might be watching this or reading articles after, in terms of what acknowledgement they can take on board for the person that has died.
Like as I said earlier, it was a really tough decision to come to for the parameters that we set around this. Look, it's something that we can consider, making apologies to those family members, but as I said, we don't have contact details for even the people that are still alive, let alone the many people that passed away over many, many decades. So it would be...
Services, you mentioned financial support services. Anything else?
Also access to existing services. We know that for many...
Is it like counselling and...
Counselling and rehabilitation through existing services like ACC. But what we do know is that for many Lake Alice survivors, it has been very difficult to access those services. So we want to make sure that they have a much smoother and easier pathway to get access to the services that they need.
Further to Laura's question, if you're saying you're going to have hard deadlines on when applications have to be made or interest needs to be registered, and you're saying you guys don't have contact details for people who went through this, let alone their families. So one might suggest that means that the government needs to be going kind of above and beyond to be able to reach out and contact these people to make sure that they are aware of this kind of stuff. So what work's being done in that space? Well,
that'll be up to the Crown Response Office, so we will task them with making sure that this is spread far and wide. They have a number of different networks of people, of survivors of Lake Alice, and they have their own networks, so we will contact people through those networks, and the Crown Response Office will make every endeavour to make sure that every person is able to put their application in so that we can start the process. And that was my last one.
Given to second-degree torture, so having to witness torture and the trauma of that.
Look, as I said earlier, this decision was informed by the United Nations Convention Against Torture. So we were only looking at those people according to those settings that were tortured at Lake Alice. So not for anyone who witnessed.
One more question. You started your presentation talking about how long we've known about this, those first disclosures, that this has been on the record for a really long time. Your colleague, the Attorney General, Judith Collins, went to the UN in 2014 and said that there was no state torture happening in New Zealand. When I asked her about it the other day, whether she would correct the record with the UN or apologise, she said certainly in 2014 I had no knowledge of any torture. She pointed out that those questions were asked in response to Iran and said, I'm happy to put New Zealand's record as a government, as a state, as a country up against Iran any day. Is that the correct response? Did she have knowledge of this in 2014? Did the government have knowledge, and should you be apologising for putting the UN wrong on that?
Look, I can't answer to what people knew and didn't know, but I think you've asked Judith Collins and she's given you her recollections and her answer. I have to
correct